High tension, atmospheric setup, Arthur's physical and mental exhaustion, the arrogant council setting a trap, and the sudden quiet rebellion. Nobody expected the silence. For 3 brutal, blood-soaked centuries, humanity didn't just request a seat at the Galactic Assembly, we bled for it. We fought through the jagged fringes of the Orion Spur, clawing through void-born horrors, Star-Eater swarms, and territorial border skirmishes just to prove we were worthy of being called civilized. We sacrificed billions of lives just to receive a formal invitation to the high chambers of the Citadel. And yet, when the High Secretary finally slid the crippling, soul-crushing subjugation treaty across the polished obsidian desk, Ambassador Arthur Pendleton didn't scream. He didn't slam his fists onto the table. He didn't drop to his knees in desperate tears, nor did he issue dramatic threats of nuclear retribution. He simply sighed. He reached down, snapped the dull brass latches of his battered leather briefcase shut, and stood up. Then, he turned his back and walked away. The most powerful beings in the known universe, entities that had crushed 10,000 star-faring species into obedient servitude, sat dead silent in their floating balconies. Frozen. They knew how to break conquerors. They knew how to starve out empires. But they had never, in 10 millennia of unbroken dominance, seen a species simply pack up their papers and walk out the door. To understand why Arthur did what he did, you have to understand the environment of the petitioner's pit. The air inside the grand chamber of the Citadel always tasted like stale copper and sterile chemical dust. Arthur hated it with a passion that burned deep in his chest. He hated the artificial gravity matrix, which was intentionally calibrated just 5% higher than Earth standard, a subtle, calculated psychological tactic designed to drag at human bones, weigh down shoulders, and cause a dull, throbbing ache in the lower back after 12 straight hours of sitting. He hated the harsh, violet-tinted atmospheric lamps hanging overhead. They were engineered to accommodate the compound, multifaceted eyes of the senior council species, but for a baseline human, they induced a perpetual, blinding migraine. Most of all, Arthur hated the neural translation earpiece jammed into his right ear canal. The device hummed with a low-frequency, high-pitched vibration every time it converted complex alien dialects into English, sending an irritating, scratching sensation straight down his skull. Right now, as the chairman spoke, the earpiece was vibrating hard enough to make Arthur's back molars ache. The formal petition of the United Terran Systems is hereby acknowledged. But found fundamentally, irredeemably flawed, droned the synthesized, metallic voice in Arthur's ear. The voice belonged to the High Chairman of the Assembly, a towering, multi-limbed, chitin-plated entity draped in sweeping layers of iridescent, light-refracting silk. The silk shifted colors according to the chairman's mood. Currently, the fabric glowed a deep, bruised, condescending shade of purple. Your heavy reliance on unmonitored industrial mining in the outer Jovian asteroid belts represents a direct violation of the Galactic Ecological Mandate, Section 4, the chairman continued. Its multiple mandibles clicking in rhythm behind the voice translator. Therefore, as a prerequisite for provisional assembly membership, all industrial assets, shipyards, and refining platforms in said sector must be immediately surrendered to the direct stewardship of the core worlds. Arthur rubbed his bloodshot eyes. He didn't bother reaching for the mute button on his desk microphone. He just leaned back into the cheap, synthetic leather chair provided for low-tier delegations. The frame groaned under his weight. They had been trapped in this chamber, at the absolute bottom of a massive, tiered amphitheater known as the Petitioner's Pit, for 6 straight months. 182 days of bureaucratic posturing, grandstanding, moving goalposts, and systematic psychological breaking. Stewardship, muttered Clara Higgins, sitting to Arthur's left. Her fingers flew across the glass surface of an air-gapped, localized data pad. Clara was Arthur's chief diplomatic aide, a woman whose razor-sharp, cynical edge was only rivaled by her terrifying organizational skill. That's a real cozy alien word for corporate asset stripping. They want the Titan shipyards. They want the helium-3 atmospheric siphons. They want the entire goddamn outer belt. I know, Arthur said quietly, his voice dry as sandpaper. He reached for his glass of water. The liquid was lukewarm, heavily recycled, and completely stripped of the natural minerals human bodies craved. It tasted like wet tin, but he drank it anyway to soothe his burning throat. They're tightening the screws, Arthur whispered. They've been doing it since the day we stepped off the shuttle. Are you going to lodge a formal objection? Clara asked, her eyes never leaving the fast-scrolling diplomatic text on her screen. Protocol dictate we file a counterproposal within 3 minutes of a territorial seizure claim. I submitted 3 counterproposals on Tuesday, Arthur replied. They rejected every single one on the grounds of improper document formatting. Apparently, I used a standard planetary margin instead of a galactic standard arc measurement. It's not about the shipyards, Clara. It never was. It's about breaking our knees before they ever let us through the front door. Arthur looked up, taking in the towering, curved walls of the amphitheater. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of star systems looked down at the human pit with cold detachment. Some were massive insectoids, their mandibles clicking in silent, arrogant amusement. Others were aquatic, floating inside pressurized, tinted transit tanks, their unblinking, dark eyes tracking the humans like specimens under a microscope. All of them viewed the Terran delegation with the exact same mixture of mild annoyance and absolute superiority. To the Council, humanity was nothing more than an upstart, loud, violent, messy species of apes from the unmapped fringes of the Orion Spur. A species that had somehow managed to split the atom, break the light barrier, and survive their own self-destructive global wars without wiping themselves out. The Council didn't like species that survived on their own grit. Independence made a species unpredictable. Unpredictable meant dangerous. The Council preferred client races, subservient, dependent species they could mold, tax, micromanage, and control. Ambassador Arthur Pendleton, the High Chairman's synthesized voice boomed, echoing through the acoustic architecture of the cavernous hall. We are waiting for your official, binding acknowledgement of the asset transfer. Arthur didn't panic. He slowly reached down, adjusted his dark navy wool suit jacket, and took a long, steady breath. Beside him, David, their chief security attaché, shifted his posture. David was a broad-shouldered fleet veteran who looked utterly miserable in a high-collared dress uniform. Out of pure muscle memory, David's right hand hovered inches from his hip, even though kinetic and energy weapons were strictly prohibited inside the Citadel. Chairman, Arthur spoke into his microphone, his tone flat, even, and devoid of the dramatic, emotional timbre alien politicians love to display. The Sol system's outer belts account for 40% of our entire gross industrial output. Surrendering them under the guise of stewardship would permanently cripple our independent fleet maintenance capabilities. We have offered a generous 12% tariff on all outer system exports. That remains our final, unalterable offer. A low murmur rippled through the upper tiers of the stadium. It was a rustling of scales, a shifting of heavy chitin, a collective hiss of disapproval. The High Chairman leaned over his elevated, gold-trimmed podium, his silken robes shifting into a dark, angry violet. You fundamentally misunderstand your position, Ambassador, the Chairman hissed softly through the translator. You are not here to negotiate terms. You are here to integrate. And integration requires total, unreserved submission. The Council has officially deemed that humanity cannot be trusted with unsupervised industrial capacity. Your species' history is violently erratic. Arthur felt a tiny muscle twitch near his jawline. Violently erratic. They always brought that up. They always cited the First Contact War, while conveniently wiping from their historical record the fact that it was the Council's own exploratory fleet that had fired first, attempting to glass an unarmed human settlement on Mars simply because the colony was built near a dormant, ancient transit gate. Humanity hadn't started that war, but we sure as hell had fought back with scavenged alien tech, crude nuclear warheads, sheer, unadulterated spite, and an ocean of human blood. We had forced a bloody, standstill stalemate against impossible odds, which was the only reason we were invited to these diplomatic talks in the first place. But the Council didn't do stalemates. What they couldn't conquer with orbital bombardment, they systematically dismantled with legal paperwork. "We have proven our systemic stability," Arthur said, keeping his voice dangerously calm. "We have scrupulously honored the ceasefire for 50 straight years. We opened our trade corridors to your merchants. We submitted to your inspectors. You have existed on probation," the High Chairman corrected smoothly, using the exact condescending tone a teacher uses with a slow, frustrating child. "A probation that officially concludes today. The final treaty has been drafted. You will review it, you will sign it, and you will accept your designated position as a junior client species of the Galactic Assembly. Or you will face the immediate, catastrophic consequences of isolation." Clara's fingers abruptly froze over her data pad screen. She turned her head slowly to look at Arthur. Her face was completely expressionless, which, to anyone who knew her, meant she was in a cold, incandescent rage. Arthur didn't say a word. He reached down into his scuffed, vintage leather briefcase resting beside his chair. The brass latches were dull, and the leather was worn down at the corners. It was an antique, a hand-me-down from his diplomatic mentor, a man who had died long before Earth ever achieved unified spaceflight. Arthur pulled out a thick, physical paper folder. He preferred physical paper. Paper couldn't be hacked, wiped, remotely corrupted, or subtly altered by an alien intelligence officer sitting on a server 3 decks up. "Let's see this treaty, then," Arthur said softly. The brutal contents of the treaty, the illusion of council generosity, Arthur realizing there is no middle ground, and the iconic moment of walking out. In the center of the human delegation's desk, a holographic projector flared to life, casting an eerie, cold blue light over Arthur's weathered face. Lines of alien text, instantly translated into precise English, scrolled rapidly into existence. The silence at the bottom of the petitioner's pit became absolute. For 10 long minutes, Arthur and Clara read the glowing blue text. It was far worse than their most pessimistic intelligence reports had warned. The Council wasn't merely demanding economic concessions or territorial access. They were demanding total, irreversible capitulation. Clause 4 mandated the immediate, complete disarmament of the sole defense fleet, reducing Earth's military force to a localized, lightly armed police presence. Clause 9 demanded that all human research into artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and faster-than-light slip-space metrics be immediately handed over to the Council Scientific Directorate. And then came Clause 14, the single sentence that turned Arthur's stomach to solid ice. Clause 14 stipulated that all future human colonization efforts beyond the Sol system were permanently halted. Any excess, unhoused human population would be systematically managed through mandatory, state-allocated migration quotas to core world industrial sectors. They called them integration zones. But Arthur knew a forced labor camp when he saw one. It was indentured servitude wrapped in bureaucratic ribbon. It was the quiet, bloodless, legal extinction of human independence. Arthur stared at the pulsing blue letters. A heavy, bone-deep exhaustion settled into his spine. It wasn't just the physical fatigue of sitting in this dark, oppressive room for 12 hours, it was the crushing weight of 20 billion human lives resting directly on his aged shoulders. If he signed this document, there would technically be peace. No plasma bombs would rain down on Earth's cities. No orbital blockades would starve the Martian colonies. Humanity would survive. We would work the Council's orbital factories, dig through frozen asteroids for alien masters, and slowly, over 3 or 4 generations, fade into the background noise of the galaxy, a docile, broken cast of primitive apes. If he refused to sign, it meant immediate war. A war against an empire that spanned thousands of star systems. The Council possessed tens of thousands of heavily armored dreadnoughts. Humanity possessed a battered, jury-rigged fleet held together by titanium welds, emergency patches, raw human grit, and a stubborn, irrational refusal to die. Arthur. Clara whispered. Her voice trembled by just a fraction of an inch. This isn't a peace treaty. It's an execution warrant. I know, Arthur murmured back softly. If we sign this, we hand them the keys to Earth, and we never get them back. Above them, the High Chairman cleared his multi-limbed throat, a sound like grinding river stones. Ambassador Pendleton. You have reviewed the terms. Is there any confusion regarding your required compliance? Arthur slowly looked up from the holographic display. The cold blue light reflected in his dark, tired eyes. There must be a severe translation error in your data matrix, Chairman, Arthur said, his voice quiet. Clause 4 demands the complete dismantling of our defensive navy. As a sovereign, independent star system, we are legally entitled to border defense. You are not a sovereign system, the chairman stated bluntly, devoid of emotion. You are an unintegrated, probationary fringe territory. Once you sign the document, the Citadel Defense Fleet will handle your security. You will have no further need for weapons of war. And the migration quotas? Arthur pressed, his voice rising just half an octave, echoing off the towering obsidian walls. You are mandating the forced relocation of millions of human citizens to worlds we do not govern, under legal jurisdictions where we have zero voting rights. The Secretary of Trade, a sleek, cold-blooded reptilian entity seated to the chairman's right, leaned forward into its microphone. Its voice translated as a slick, oily tenor. It is an extraordinary opportunity for your primitive population to learn civilized labor practices, Ambassador. You should be down on your knees expressing gratitude. Most species that defy the Council's expansion are simply eradicated. We are offering you a place in galactic society. At the bottom, where your species belongs, until you prove yourselves capable of higher thought. Arthur looked around the vast, looming amphitheater. Thousands of alien eyes stared down at the three humans trapped at the bottom of the pit. They were all waiting for the exact same thing. They were waiting for the human to break. They had witnessed this precise scene unfold 100 times over the past millennium. A young, proud, fiercely independent species arrives at the Citadel full of fire and grand ideals. They demand respect. The Council smiles, nods, and drags them into endless diplomatic committee meetings. They stall them. They bleed their economy dry with tariffs. They isolate them. And then, when the young species is utterly exhausted and desperate, the Council presents an impossible, devastating choice. The ambassadors of those lesser species always argued at first. Sometimes they wept publicly. Sometimes they shouted furious, useless threats of cosmic vengeance. But in the end, they always picked up the digital stylus. They always signed. Because survival instinct almost always overrides pride. The Council fed on that exact moment of public submission. It was the fuel that kept their absolute, tyrannical authority alive. Arthur looked down at the digital signature pad pulsing quietly on his desk. Next to the sleek, glowing pad lay his grandfather's vintage Parker fountain pen. He always carried it in his suit pocket, a physical reminder of Earth's messy, turbulent, beautiful history. He closed his eyes for a single second. In that brief moment of darkness, Arthur didn't see the alien assembly. He thought about the cold, falling rain over London. He thought about the red, iron-heavy dust of the Martian colonies, where human men and women worked 18-hour shifts in underground biodomes just to make the soil breathable for their children. He thought about the young men and women currently stationed on the orbital defense platforms surrounding Jupiter, staring out into the black void, waiting for a signal from Earth. Arthur had spent his entire 40-year career trying to prevent war. He was a diplomat. His job was to find compromise, to bridge impossible gaps, to swallow his pride for the greater good of his people. But looking at the glowing blue death warrant hovering in front of him, Arthur realized a fundamental, terrifying truth: there is no middle ground with a machine designed to grind you into dust. Compromise with a tyrant is just a slower form of execution. Ambassador Arthur, the High Chairman's voice echoed, the false patience completely peeling away to reveal cold, unyielding iron underneath. The session is concluding. Protocol requires you to state your formal plea for galactic integration, followed by your digital signature. Proceed immediately. Arthur opened his eyes. He turned his head and looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. The anxiety had completely vanished from her face, replaced by a cold, sharp, crystal-clear resolve. She gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Arthur looked at David. The security officer stood tall, his jaw set like granite, his eyes locked onto the Citadel guard stationed near the exits. He was ready. Arthur reached out his hand. He didn't touch the digital signature pad. Instead, he picked up his grandfather's antique fountain pen, slid it smoothly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and leaned into the microphone. No. The shockwave of the rejection, Arthur casually packing up his desk, the absolute silence of the council, and the long walk out of the chamber. The single, quiet syllable echoed through the massive, cavernous hall. It bounced off the polished obsidian walls, ringing sharply against the vaulted, dome ceiling. For a long, agonizing moment, absolutely nothing happened. The complex translation matrix in the alien delegates' earpieces hesitated, scrambling through linguistic databases, trying to find the diplomatic context, the subtle nuance, or the hidden political bargaining tactic behind the word. It couldn't find any. The High Chairman shifted his massive, multi-limbed bulk, his iridescent silk robes rustling loudly in the sudden, dead silence of the room. The fabric flashed from a dark purple to an angry, confused crimson. Ambassador. The chairman said, his voice unusually slow. The translation unit appears to have suffered a temporary system malfunction. You did not state your formal plea. There is no malfunction, Chairman, Arthur said. His voice was perfectly steady. The heavy, soul-crushing fatigue that had weighed down his shoulders for 6 months seemed to evaporate in a single second, replaced by an intense, crystalline clarity. He wasn't tired anymore. He was simply done. You asked for our plea for integration, Arthur continued, his voice echoing off the balconies. We have none. You presented a treaty. We reject it. A collective, sharp gasp swept through the upper tiers of the amphitheater. Mandibles clicked in sudden agitation, heavy aquatic tanks sloshed, scales rattled against stone seats. The Secretary of Trade leaned forward so fast its reptilian snout nearly slammed into its silver microphone. You reject it, the creature hissed, its eyes wide with disbelief. You cannot reject a final mandate of the Galactic Assembly. To reject this offer is to choose complete galactic isolation. It is to choose total economic embargo. It is to choose. The reptilian creature trailed off, suddenly unwilling to utter the word annihilation on the official assembly record. I know precisely what it means, Arthur said calmly. He reached out and deliberately pressed the power switch on the holographic projector. The glowing blue text of the treaty instantly vanished, plunging the human desk back into the harsh glare of the violet overhead lights. Then, Arthur reached down, grabbed the leather handle of his open briefcase, and set it squarely on top of the desk. He began to pack. He picked up his physical paper folders and placed them inside with a soft, distinct thwack. He picked up his half-empty glass of lukewarm water, hesitated for a brief second, and set it back down on the desk. He took his personal data pad, powered it down entirely, and slid it into its leather protective sleeve. Zip. In the dead silent, vast chamber, the mundane, everyday sounds of office supplies being packed away echoed like thunder. Clara followed his lead without a second's hesitation. She didn't say a word. She closed her heavy-duty diplomatic transit case and snapped the titanium locking latches shut. Clack clack. The thousands of council members watched in utter, stunned disbelief. This was completely off script. Where were the desperate pleas? Where was the weeping? Where were the furious, suicidal threats of a cornered species? The human ambassador wasn't throwing a political tantrum. He was simply packing up his desk like an office worker at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening. "What are you doing?" the High Chairman demanded, his synthesized voice losing its aristocratic smoothness, cracking with genuine, unscripted shock. "Ambassador. If you step away from that desk without signing, you forfeit all access to the Hyperlane Transit Network. You forfeit Council economic protection. Your star system will be placed under immediate, permanent planetary quarantine." Arthur closed the leather lid of his briefcase. He pressed down firmly on the brass locks. Click. Click. The twin metallic clicks sounded like a pair of kinetic handguns being cocked in an underground bunker. Arthur grabbed the handle, stood up straight, and squared his shoulders. His lower back twinged with pain, but he kept his posture perfectly rigid. Clara stood beside him, clutching her transit case to her chest. David stepped out from behind the desk, positioning his heavy frame slightly ahead of Arthur, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of alien guards, daring a single one of them to make a move. Arthur looked up at the High Chairman one final time. He didn't look angry. He didn't look terrified. He just looked at the ancient, multi-limbed alien with a profound, pitying exhaustion. "Chairman," Arthur said, choosing not to use the microphone, forcing his natural voice to carry across the empty stone floor of the pit. "For 6 months, you have sat up there on your high throne and told us how small we are. You have spent every single day telling us how desperately we need you. You assumed that because we came to this table, we were weak." Arthur took 2 deliberate steps out from behind the diplomatic desk. "We came to this table because humans are polite," Arthur said, his voice ringing loud and clear. "We came because we wanted to see if the great Galactic Council was truly a civilization of peers, or merely a cartel of arrogant tyrants. You have given us our answer. You are making a fatal error, human," the High Chairman rumbled, rising to his full, terrifying physical height. In the aisles leading down to the pit, hulking, heavily armored Citadel guards began to step out from the shadows, their energy pikes humming to life with crackling blue electricity. "You are walking out into the dark void all alone," the chairman roared. "We were born in the dark," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying a cold, razor-sharp edge. "We survived it just fine before we met you. We'll survive it long after you're gone." Arthur turned his back on the chairman. He turned his back on the entire Galactic Assembly. "Let's go," Arthur said to Clara and David. The central aisle leading out of the petitioner's pit was 100 yards long. It had been intentionally designed by ancient Citadel architects to be a walk of shame, a long, exhausting physical distance meant to emphasize the lowly, subservient status of the petitioner as they begged for audience. Now, as the 3 humans walked it, it felt like a triumph. Their footsteps echoed rhythmically against the polished stone floor. Step. 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 Heavy leather dress shoes on ancient alien granite. Thousands of alien delegates watched them in absolute, frozen silence. The atmosphere was so thick with tension it felt like physical pressure crushing down on the room. Nobody shouted. Nobody ordered the guards to attack. There was simply no protocol for this. In 10,000 years of continuous council history, not a single species had ever just left. At the end of the long aisle stood 2 massive, ornate wooden double doors, guarded by 4 towering Citadel troopers. The guards stood paralyzed, looking up toward the chairman's high podium, desperately waiting for orders. The chairman just stood there, his silken robes wildly fluctuating between an angry crimson and a pale, sickly white. He couldn't give the order to attack. To use physical force to stop an unarmed ambassador from leaving a peaceful diplomatic negotiation would be an admission that the Council's legal authority was a complete lie. It would prove the human right in front of thousands of vassal species. Arthur reached the massive doors. He didn't even slow down. David stepped forward, grabbed the heavy brass handles, and pulled with all his strength. The giant doors swung open with a deep, reverberating groan, revealing the bright, sterile white corridor of the Citadel concourse beyond. The three humans walked through. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a booming, thunderous thud. Escaping the station, boarding the military cruiser, Arthur issuing the nightmare order, Protocol Winter, and the fleet slipping away. Out in the wide, sterile concourse, Clara finally let out a long, ragged breath she felt like she had been holding for an entire hour. Her hands were shaking violently. She leaned against the polished wall, looking at Arthur with wide, panicked eyes. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What in God's name did we just do?" Arthur reached up, unknotted his silk tie, and unbuttoned the top collar of his dress shirt, letting the cool air hit his skin. He looked down the long, glass-walled corridor toward the private docking bays, where their personal shuttle was waiting to carry them to the heavy cruiser UNS Aegis anchored in high orbit. "We stopped playing their game," Arthur said. There was no fear in his eyes, only a fierce, freezing spark that hadn't been there in months. "Get on your pad, Clara," Arthur ordered smoothly. "Contact the Aegis. Tell the captain to spin up the slip space drives immediately. Send a high-priority, quantum-encrypted burst to Earth Command. Tell them the diplomatic mission has failed." "And then?" David asked, his hand still resting near his sidearm, his eyes scanning the empty corridor for stealth operatives. "What happens when we get back?" Arthur picked up his briefcase and increased his walking pace. A grim, dark smile touched the corners of his mouth. "And then," Arthur said, "we go home, and we lock the doors. If they want our solar system, they're going to have to come down into the mud and bleed for every single inch of it." They boarded their shuttle in record time. As the heavy airlock door sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss and the small craft decoupled from the sprawling, glittering spire of the Citadel, Arthur sat by the thick viewport. Watching the alien station shrink against the infinite backdrop of distant stars. Back in the Grand Assembly Chamber, the Galactic Council remained utterly paralyzed. The glowing blue text of the unsigned treaty still hovered over the empty human desk like a ghost. 20 minutes later, the shuttle slammed into the primary hangar bay of the UNS Aegis. The hangar smelled glorious. It smelled of heavy hydraulic fluid, burned ozone, scorched metal, and stale human sweat. To Arthur, after 6 months of synthetic alien air, it was the greatest smell in the universe. The moment the shuttle's magnetic landing gear locked onto the deck plates with a heavy, metallic clank, the smooth, diplomatic posture Arthur had maintained completely collapsed. His shoulders slumped forward. He looked every bit his 60 years, a tired, worn-out man who had just placed a massive target on the backs of 20 billion human beings. The shuttle ramp lowered. A squad of heavily armed Earth Marines stood at attention, clad in matte black tactical armor that absorbed the overhead fluorescent lighting. Standing in front of them was Captain Hayes, a grizzled fleet veteran with deep lines carved into his face. Arthur stepped off the ramp, his knee joints popping loudly. Captain Hayes didn't bother offering a formal salute, the situation had moved far beyond military formalities. "Ambassador," Hayes said, his voice deep and gravelly. "We tracked your departure from the station. The Citadel defense grid just went to high tactical alert, but they haven't locked targeting sensors on us yet. Nobody is chasing us. They're too shocked to shoot," Clara said, stepping off the ramp behind Arthur, pulling her hair back into a tight ponytail. "The council bureaucracy doesn't have a pre-written protocol for a walkout. They'll have to form 6 different subcommittees just to decide whether to classify us as a hostile state or a rebellious province. That takes time." "How much time?" Hayes asked, turning on his heel and leading the delegation through the ship's cramped, metallic corridors. Clara pulled out her pad, her fingers flying across the interface. "Given their communication lag and structural inefficiency. 3 weeks before they issue a formal condemnation. A month before they assemble a regional task force. Maybe 2 months before they figure out the logistics to cross into the Orion Spur." 2 months, Captain Hayes muttered as they stepped into the elevator. "That's nothing." "It's a lifetime," Arthur corrected softly. They reached the Combat Information Center, CIC. The room was bathed in the dull red glow of tactical battle lighting. Dozens of young officers sat at recessed consoles, their voices a quiet, constant hum of navigation coordinates and reactor checks. In the center of the room, a massive 3D holographic display showed the sprawling structure of the Citadel shrinking rapidly behind them. Navigation, spin up the slipspace drive. Captain Hayes ordered, stepping up to the central command table. Plot a direct course for Sol. No intermediate stops. Maximum burn. Drive spooling, Captain. Slipspace insertion in 40 seconds. Arthur walked up to the edge of the tactical display. He watched the alien station, a monument to 10,000 years of absolute, unquestioned galactic dominion, fade into the blackness. He felt an agonizing weight pressing against his ribs. He had actually done it. He had walked away. Arthur, David said softly, stepping up beside him. You know what they're going to say back home, right? The Prime Minister is going to demand your head on a spike. The Prime Minister sent me there to secure our future, Arthur said flatly. That treaty required us to surrender our shipyards, disarm our navy, and send our youth to alien labor camps. There wouldn't have been a future left to protect. I know that, David said quietly. And you know that. But the politicians in Geneva? They're going to claim you provoked an unwinnable war. I didn't provoke a war, Arthur said, staring into the holographic grid. I just refused to sign our suicide note. Arthur turned to Captain Hayes. Captain, I need an immediate, priority quantum comms channel to Earth Defense Command. Encrypt it with the one-time manual paths. No digital keys. What's the message, Ambassador? Hayes asked. Arthur looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. He clenched them into tight fists until his knuckles turned white. Message reads as follows, Arthur said, his voice cold and unwavering. Diplomacy has failed. The Council demands unconditional surrender. I have formally rejected their terms. Initiate Protocol Winter immediately. May God have mercy on us all. The entire Combat Information Center fell dead silent. The low hum of the crew vanished instantly. Protocol Winter wasn't a standard military mobilization order. It was the total, unrestricted conversion of the entire human race into a singular war machine. It meant absolute rationing. It meant drafting every able-bodied civilian. It meant seizing every commercial cargo hauler, every asteroid mining vessel, and every garbage scow in the Sol system, retrofitting them with heavy titanium armor plating and high-yield railguns. It was the final, desperate contingency plan drafted 50 years ago, a plan designed for the complete, total defense of the human species. Slipspace jump in 3, 2, 1. Mark. The stars on the primary view screen stretched into brilliant, infinitely long lines of blinding white light. The UNS Aegis tore a hole in the fabric of spacetime and slipped through, leaving the Citadel far behind. Back on Earth, the political backlash, the realization that the Council sent a weak force, and the total militarization of the Sol system. Deep beneath the solid granite of the Rocky Mountains, the Cheyenne Mountain complex hummed with an anxious, frantic energy. The air inside the subterranean command bunker was thick with the smell of scorched ozone, hot server racks, and stale, bitter coffee. Prime Minister Thomas stood at the head of the briefing table. He was a man built entirely for peacetime, genial, media-trained, well-dressed, and excessively focused on overnight approval ratings. Right now, his face was the color of wet chalk. Arthur sat across from him. He had been back on Earth for 3 days. He hadn't slept for more than 2 consecutive hours since his return. His tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple, rumpled button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves. You walked out, the Prime Minister repeated for the 5th time, his voice cracking with disbelief. You literally packed your briefcase and walked out on the masters of the known galaxy. Yes, Prime Minister, Arthur said calmly, taking a sip of black coffee. Did you at least offer a counter-demand? Shouted the Secretary of State, a woman hovering on the edge of a hyperventilation attack. Did you give them a dramatic speech? Something we could spin to the press? No, Arthur replied. I packed my bags and left. They aren't dramatic warriors, Madam Secretary. They are bureaucrats. Dramatic speeches are something they know how to counter. Absolute silence broke their algorithm. And now they are going to wipe us out, the Prime Minister yelled, finally losing his composure, slamming his hands on the table. We sent you to negotiate a 3% reduction on helium-3 tariffs. You come back and activate Protocol Winter. You've doomed us all. With respect, Prime Minister, read the damn document, interrupted General Cole. Cole was the Supreme Commander of Terran Defense Forces. He was a massive, scarred veteran whose face looked like it had been carved out of rough granite. He stepped forward and slammed a thick paper folder onto the center of the table. Smack. Arthur brought back the hard physical copy, Cole growled, his dark eyes glaring at the politicians. Clause 4. Clause 9. Clause 14. Read them. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a corporate liquidation of the human race. If Arthur had signed that piece of paper, I would be handing over the security codes to our planetary defense grid right now. My soldiers would be disarmed. Your children would be placed on transportation lists for alien mining colonies. The Prime Minister stared at the folder as if it were an armed explosive. So. We fight, he whispered. With what? They have thousands of capital ships. Clara Higgins stepped out from the shadowy back corner of the room. She tapped a command into her data pad, and the massive screens lining the bunker walls flared to life. They have thousands of dreadnoughts on paper, Prime Minister, Clara corrected, her voice cutting through the panic with surgical precision. We've spent the last 72 hours analyzing intercepted quantum comms traffic from the Citadel. They aren't mobilizing an armada. General Cole narrowed his eyes. Explain. The Galactic Council is a bloated, 10,000-year-old bureaucratic machine, Clara said, pacing slowly behind Arthur's chair. They haven't fought a peer-to-peer war against a unified state in over 5 centuries. They are used to policing fractured, disorganized client worlds. When Arthur walked out, it triggered an unprecedented jurisdictional nightmare for them. She pulled up a tactical map of the Orion Spur. The Council's military caste cannot legally deploy a high armada without a formal, unanimous declaration of war from the civilian Senate. The civilian Senate refuses to declare war, because officially acknowledging humanity as a sovereign threat legitimizes our walkout. So what are they doing? Cole asked. They compromised, Clara said, zooming in on an approaching vector. They've dispatched a compliance task force. 2 heavy cruisers, 12 frigates, and a troop transport. It's a glorified police raid. They expect to jump into Seoul, fire a few warning shots across our bow, and watch us scramble over each other to surrender. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table. They still think we're desperate. They think I threw a childish diplomatic tantrum, and that the moment an alien warship appears in our sky, you will arrest me, beg for their forgiveness. And sign the treaty. The Prime Minister stared at the tactical display. The terrifying reality of the situation slowly sank in, burning away his political panic, leaving behind a cold, hard core of human stubbornness. They think we're going to roll over, Thomas whispered. They expect us to act like a broken, terrified client species, Arthur said. They expect us to play by the Citadel's rules. General Cole let out a low, terrifying chuckle. Well, we aren't civilized. And we sure as hell aren't broken. Cole turned to the Prime Minister. Sir, I need full executive authorization. Total industrial mobilization. I want the Jovian shipyards running 24 hours a day. I want every belt miner armed with proximity charges. I want the Oort cloud turned into a minefield. The Prime Minister looked around the room, at the terrified politicians, the grim general, and finally at Arthur. The diplomat who had started a war by simply saying no. Thomas reached down and straightened his tie. "Do it, General. Lock the doors. Turn this entire solar system into a fortress. If they want Earth, make them bleed for every single mile of vacuum." Over the next 60 days, the Sol system underwent a radical, terrifying transformation. The messy, fractured, bickering nations of Earth suddenly found a single, unifying purpose. The long-standing political feuds between the Martian colonies and Earth elites vanished overnight. The fiercely independent belt miners quietly handed over their navigation charts to the military and began retrofitting their industrial plasma cutters into heavy, close-range anti-ship weapons. Factories on Earth that had produced luxury automobiles were retooled in less than a week to produce heavy kinetic kill vehicles. The massive orbital rings around Jupiter, usually a bustling hub of civilian commerce, went completely dark, bristling with thousands of newly installed railgun batteries. Humanity didn't build sleek, beautiful ships with glowing, elegant shields. We built brutal, ugly, utilitarian slabs of thick titanium and depleted uranium. Ships designed to take a direct hit, spit blood, and deliver a sledgehammer blow in return. We waited in the dark, silent and deadly, watching the outer edge of our home system. The arrival of the Council's Compliance Task Force, their arrogant radio message, Admiral Jenkins' brutal response, and the 14-second destruction of the alien fleet. 64 days after Arthur Pendleton walked out of the Galactic Assembly, the long-range sensor grids at the edge of the Oort cloud tripped. Admiral Jenkins stood on the bridge of the UNS Vanguard, a massive, blocky dreadnought anchored in the dead, frozen space just past the orbit of Pluto. Jenkins was a legendary veteran of the First Contact War. His left arm was a heavy, cybernetic prosthetic, a permanent souvenir from a plasma burn sustained 40 years prior. He drank his coffee black, and he didn't blink when the red tactical alarms began to scream. "Slip space ruptures detected, Admiral," the sensor operator called out, her voice tight but disciplined. "Grid 049. Mass signatures match Citadel profiles. Bring them up on the main view screen," Jenkins ordered, taking a slow, calm sip from his mug. The optical display shifted, cutting through the blackness of deep space. 14 blinding flashes of brilliant violet light tore through the void as spacetime collapsed. The Council's Compliance Task Force revealed itself. They were breathtakingly beautiful ships. Smooth, sweeping hulls constructed from a pristine, pearlescent white alloy that practically glowed against the dark backdrop of space. The two heavy battle cruisers in the center were elegant, shaped like majestic sea predators, bristling with sleek energy emitters. They looked like works of high art. They looked profoundly arrogant. "They are broadcasting on all open civilian channels, sir," the comms officer reported. "Standard translation matrix." "Put it on the bridge speakers," Jenkins said. The bridge filled with a smooth, perfectly synthesized alien voice. It sounded utterly bored. "Attention, primitive Terran forces. This is Fleet Commander Vile of the Citadel Compliance Directorate. Your political representatives have committed grave violations of Galactic Assembly statutes. You are hereby commanded to immediately power down all weapon systems, disable your sublight engines, and prepare to be boarded. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will result in immediate, total pacification." Admiral Jenkins didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked at the tactical holographic overlay. The Council Task Force had dropped out of slip space in the exact coordinate sector human tactical analysts had predicted 2 months ago. Right in the geometric center of an engagement grid designated Killbox Alpha. "Shall I open a return channel, Admiral?" the comms officer asked. "Send a formal reply." "No," Jenkins said softly. "Sir. They are waiting for our response. They're bureaucrats with guns, son," Jenkins said, setting his coffee mug down on the console with a soft clink. "They want to talk. They want to issue stern warnings. They want us to explain ourselves so they can feel intellectually superior before they open fire. We aren't here to talk. Ambassador Arthur did all the talking we'll ever need. Jenkins stepped up to the Central Command podium. His voice dropped an octave, carrying the terrifying, absolute authority of a man who knew precisely what he was about to do. Fleet-wide command, Jenkins growled into his mic, no warning shots. No demands for surrender. Spool the magnetic coils. Target the 2 heavy cruisers. Synchronized firing solutions. Fire on my mark. Across the dark, frozen edge of the solar system, 200 human warships woke up. They had been running completely cold for 3 weeks, their heat sinks buried deep inside their insulated hulls to mask their infrared signatures. Now, their reactors flared to absolute maximum power. On the bridge of the Citadel flagship, Commander Vile was leaning back in his velvet command chair, waiting for the panicked, terrifying human radio response he knew was coming. He expected a terrified politician begging for mercy. Instead, his sensor officer let out a sudden, high-pitched screech of absolute terror. Commander! Multiple massive heat blooms detected. Hundreds of them. What? Vile snapped, sitting upright. Where? Everywhere. They were running cold. They aren't retreating, sir, they are locking military-grade targeting radars directly onto our hull. Preposterous. Vile sneered. They wouldn't dare open fire on a council flag. Commander Vile never finished his sentence. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Admiral Jenkins watched the green synchronization lights on his console flash in perfect unison. Fire, Jenkins said. In the vacuum of space, there was no sound. There were no flashy, glowing laser beams. There was only the brutal, unforgiving physics of kinetic electromagnetism. 200 heavy railguns fired simultaneously. 200 multi-ton slugs of solid, depleted uranium accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. They crossed the vacuum between the 2 fleets in less than half a second. The Citadel battle cruisers possessed advanced energy shields designed to deflect high-energy plasma and dissipate heat from laser fire. They were not engineered to stop the kinetic equivalent of a mountain moving at Mach 50. The first volley struck the lead alien cruiser. The pristine, pearlescent hull didn't just breach, it shattered like cheap glass. The sheer kinetic shockwave transferred through the vessel's structural spine, snapping the elegant, multi-billion credit warship completely in half. The ship's atmospheric envelope vented instantly, creating a brief, glittering cloud of frozen oxygen and flash-vaporized alien crew. The second cruiser took 30 heavy slugs directly to its primary engineering section. Its antimatter drive core ruptured instantly, and the ship simply ceased to exist, evaporating in a blinding, miniature supernova of white-hot radiation. In less than 4 seconds, the 2 most powerful warships in the Council's regional fleet were reduced to expanding clouds of glowing, radioactive debris. The remaining 12 alien frigates froze. Their maneuvering thrusters fired erratically as their captains panicked, suddenly realizing they had flown blindly into a slaughterhouse. Reload, Admiral Jenkins ordered, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Shift targeting locks to the frigates. Let's see how much they like the dark. The slaughter lasted exactly 14 seconds. The aftermath of the 14-second battle, the transmission sent back to the Council, the escalation into a 3-year war, and the economic strain breaking the Citadel from within. By the time the human railguns cycled for a third volley, there was almost nothing left to target. The pristine, pearlescent frigates of the Galactic Council had scattered like terrified insects. 3 had managed to initiate frantic, emergency slipspace jumps, tearing unstable holes in spacetime just to escape the kill zone. 4 lay drifting in the void, their drive engines shredded by kinetic shrapnel, venting reactive plasma into space. On the bridge of the Vanguard, the silence was deafening. The young bridge crew stared at their tactical displays in stunned awe. They had trained for this moment for years, but seeing the legendary apex predators of the galaxy swatted out of the sky in seconds was a sight none of them were prepared for. "Cease fire," Admiral Jenkins said quietly. "Comms, jam all localized subspace frequencies. I don't want those crippled ships communicating with each other." "Done, sir," the comms officer replied, his fingers flying across his console. Jenkins walked over to the tactical display, looking at the 4 crippled alien frigates. "Prep marine boarding detachments. Target the largest intact frigate. We need prisoners, and more importantly, we need their uncorrupted navigation data banks." The boarding action was not a glamorous space battle, it was a brutal, mechanical clearing operation. Human boarding pods slammed into the hull of the alien frigate with bone-shattering force. Magnetic clamps locked onto the deck plates, plasma torches sliced through the elegant, curving bulkheads in seconds. The Citadel guards, wearing ornate ceremonial armor designed to intimidate civilian protesters on client worlds, were completely unprepared for Terran orbital drop shock marines. There were no formal speeches. There were no demands for surrender. The Marines cleared the metallic corridors with flashbangs, breaching charges, and heavy kinetic shotguns. The alien crew, deafened, disoriented, and bleeding, threw down their weapons in absolute terror. The entire ship was secured in 12 minutes. 5 days later, on the Citadel at the core of the galaxy, the High Chairman sat in his private, dim chambers. He was resting his compound eyes, trying to ignore the mounting headache of managing a fracturing empire. His private console chimed with a high-priority, Level 1 override. The chairman reached out and tapped the glowing crystal interface. This had better be Commander Vile reporting the successful pacification of the human system. The screen flickered, but it didn't show Vile. It showed a raw, unedited military video feed. The High Chairman watched in mounting horror as the sensor telemetry of the Compliance Task Force played out before his eyes. He watched the massive heat signatures flare from the cold black void. He watched his 2 heaviest battle cruisers vanish in a fraction of a second. He watched his elite forces panic and flee like cowards. Then, the telemetry cut out, replaced by a direct video transmission. Sitting at a metallic desk was a human male in a stark, utilitarian military uniform. He had a cybernetic left arm that hummed faintly, and he was calmly drinking a dark liquid from a ceramic cup. "My name is Admiral Jenkins of the United Terran Defense Fleet," the man said, his tone casual, almost bored. "We have recovered 214 survivors from your task force. We have packed them into a single, stripped-down transport shuttle and programmed its automated computer to return to your coordinates. We removed the weapons. We removed the long-range comms." Jenkins leaned forward, staring directly into the camera lens with cold, unblinking eyes. "Do not send another police force," Jenkins said softly. "The next time you cross our border, send an army. Or don't come at all." The screen snapped to black. The High Chairman sat frozen. His iridescent silk robes flashed a pale, sickly, terrified white. He had ruled the assembly for 2 centuries. He had broken 50 species. But staring at the blank screen, a freezing realization settled into his chest: they hadn't poked a primitive wild animal. They had woken a monster. The Galactic Council, bound by millennia of pride, could not back down. Ancient, arrogant empires do not admit mistakes, they simply throw more blood and resources at a problem until it vanishes. 2 months after the massacre at Pluto, the Council officially declared war. They assembled the Grand Armada, a colossal fleet of 4,000 warships drafted from a dozen vassal species. It was the largest military mobilization in 1,000 years. They intended to crush Earth under the sheer weight of numbers. They expected the war to last a week. It lasted 3 brutal years. The Siege of Sol was not a war of grand, heroic fleet battles, it was an agonizing meat grinder. It was trench warfare fought across billions of miles of freezing vacuum. The Council fleet jumped into Sol with overwhelming numbers, but they immediately ran into the brutal reality of human paranoia. The entire Oort cloud was seeded with millions of cloaked, autonomous proximity mines. The Council lost 300 ships before they even caught visual sight of a human vessel. When they finally pushed past the outer gas giants, they encountered the Jovian defense grid. Humans hadn't just built defensive walls, we had turned the entire asteroid belt into a chaotic, spinning death trap. Human corvettes, painted pitch black and running on zero power, would drift inside hollowed-out asteroids. When a Council patrol passed by, the asteroid would split open, the corvette would unleash a devastating point-blank railgun barrage. And then burn hard into the debris field before the aliens could lock weapons. It was ugly, it was terrifying, and it was bleeding the Council dry. Back on Earth, Arthur Pendleton walked through the underground concrete tunnels of the London evacuation zone. The air smelled of bleach, crowded bodies, and synthetic protein rations. The constant, low rumble of planetary defense generators vibrated through his boots. He looked 20 years older. His hair was completely white, and the dark circles under his eyes were permanent scars of fatigue. Clara walked beside him, wearing military fatigues now, her hair cropped short. "Production at the lunar shipyards is down 4%, Clara reported, her voice tight. "We're running out of raw titanium. General Cole has ordered the stripping of civilian skyscrapers in North America." "Do it," Arthur said softly. "The orbital cannons need armor plating." "Arthur." Clara stopped in the corridor. "Casualties from the Saturn counteroffensive just came in. We lost the Third Fleet. 80 ships. 40,000 men and women." Arthur stopped. He leaned his back against the cold concrete wall and closed his eyes. 40,000. The numbers had stopped making emotional sense a year ago. Did they hold the line? Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They held," Clara said. "The Council forces retreated to Titan." "But Arthur, we can't do this forever. We're producing ships faster than they can destroy them, but we are running out of human beings to fly them." Arthur opened his eyes. A makeshift medical triage station had been set up in an old subway station nearby. Cots lined the concrete platforms. Wounded sailors, burned and missing limbs, lay quietly under thin thermal blankets. A woman in a grease-stained jumpsuit was sitting beside a cot, holding the pale hand of her bandaged son. She looked up and saw Arthur standing there. Arthur froze. He expected hatred. He expected her to scream at him, to curse the diplomat who had walked out of the peace talks and brought the wrath of the heavens down on their heads. Instead, the woman just looked at him. Her face was lined with deep exhaustion. She looked at her wounded son, then back at Arthur. Slowly, deliberately, she gave him a single, grim nod of respect. Then she turned back to her boy. Arthur swallowed the lump in his throat. "They know, Clara," Arthur whispered. "They know what the alternative was. A collar and a chain. We hold the line. If we bleed, the Council bleeds double. And I guarantee you, an empire built on paperwork has a much lower tolerance for pain than we do. The Council collapsing under war costs, the chairman coming to Mars to beg for peace. Arthur forcing him to sign the treaty with his grandfather's pen, and the final powerful ending message. Arthur was right. 400 light-years away, the Citadel was tearing itself apart from the inside. The Grand Armada was supposed to be a swift, surgical campaign. Instead, it had become an unwinnable, economic quagmire. The core worlds, accustomed to luxury and imported goods, were suddenly facing severe rationing. The vassal species, seeing the legendary Citadel fleet paralyzed and bleeding against a single star system of apes, were beginning to ask dangerous questions. Rebellions were breaking out on the galactic fringes. Tax revenues plummeted by 40%. In the Grand Assembly Hall, alien politicians were screaming at each other. Mandibles clicked in fury, fists slammed onto desks. The High Chairman looked down into the petitioner's pit. It was completely empty. The cheap leather chair where Arthur Pendleton had sat 3 years ago remained vacant. The chairman realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that the human hadn't walked away out of arrogance. He had walked away because he knew exactly what humanity was capable of. He had looked at the massive machine of the Galactic Council, realized it was powered by bureaucracy and comfortable complacency, and thrown a giant steel wrench directly into the gears. The Council could not win this war. Even if they eventually managed to burn Earth, it would bankrupt the Empire and destroy their authority forever. The High Chairman raised a trembling hand. "Recall the Armada," he whispered. The chamber went dead silent. "Recall the Armada," gasped the Secretary of Trade. "Chairman, that is madness." "Recall the Armada to the edge of their system," the chairman repeated, feeling 10,000 years of absolute rule crumbling around his shoulders. "Prepare a diplomatic shuttle. Unarmed. Get me a translation matrix." The peace meeting did not take place in a grand alien amphitheater. There were no floating balconies, no violet lights, and no holographic projectors. It took place on a battered, heavily scarred defense platform orbiting Mars. General Cole led the alien delegation through the station's cramped corridors. He didn't slow his brutal pace to accommodate the chairman's ceremonial robes. The air smelled of burnt ozone, recycled sweat, and dried blood. As the High Chairman walked, he saw the true, terrifying cost of the war. He passed open bulkheads where human mechanics, caked in grease and burn scars, slept slumped over ammunition crates. He saw wounded Marines tracking his movement with cold, unblinking hatred. There was no despair here. Only a terrifying, mechanical endurance. Cole slammed his fist against a heavy blast door. The steel door ground open with a screech of unlubricated gears. "In," Cole barked. The chairman stepped inside. It was a stripped-down briefing room. In the center sat a heavily scratched aluminum table. Arthur Pendleton sat on the far side. The diplomat looked like he had aged 20 years. His navy suit was fraying at the cuffs. He had lost weight, his cheekbones sharp and hollow. David stood behind him, wearing a scuffed combat rig, his hand resting casually on his heavy sidearm. Between Arthur and the empty chair opposite him lay a single piece of physical paper. "Sit," Arthur said, his voice raspy. The chairman lowered his massive bulk into the cheap folding chair. It groaned under his weight. He looked at the paper. "This is completely unacceptable," the chairman whispered through his translator. "I have read your terms. You demand total sovereignty. You demand the permanent removal of all Citadel posts in the Orion Spur, zero tariffs on human trade fleets. Unconditional return of all prisoners. This is pure extortion." "That's right," Arthur said, not moving an inch. "You offer nothing in return," the chairman slammed a fist on the table. "The council still has reserves. We can blockade your system for a century." "No, you can't," Arthur replied, leaning forward, locking eyes with the alien. "We've been reading your decrypted naval traffic for 6 months. Your reserves are currently putting down food riots on your capital worlds. Your economy is in freefall. Your supply lines are bleeding out because our stealth frigates are hunting your convoys. You are out of money, you are out of political capital, and you are out of time." The chairman recoiled. Their intelligence was brutally accurate. Arthur tapped the paper. "We offer you the only thing that matters, Chairman. We offer to stop killing your people. We offer to let your empire survive this decade. If you sign this, we stay on our side of the border, and you get to go back to your Senate and pretend this was a strategic realignment." The chairman looked at Arthur. He saw no fear in the diplomat's sunken eyes. Only cold, uncompromising iron. The humans didn't care about the mathematical logic of submission. They would gladly burn their own solar system to radioactive bedrock just to deny the council the satisfaction of owning it. The chairman reached out a trembling appendage. "If I sign this, the other client species will know we can be bled. They will know the council can be defied. They already know, Arthur said softly. You spent 3 years trying to kick our door down, and you broke your own leg doing it. The illusion of your invincibility is gone. Now, sign the paper, or leave. Arthur reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his grandfather's antique Parker fountain pen. He uncapped it, the gold nib catching the harsh overhead light, and slid it across the metal table. Sign, Arthur ordered. Slowly, the high chairman picked up the pen. He gripped it awkwardly in his primary manipulator, dragging the gold nib across the thick paper, leaving a heavy, jagged ink-stained smear, the formal seal of the Citadel. He pushed the paper back across the table. Arthur took it. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He carefully folded the document and placed it into his breast pocket, right next to his heart. The ceasefire is active, Arthur said, standing up. General Cole will escort you to your shuttle. Do not deviate from your exit vector by a single degree, or our automated grid will turn your ship into slag. Goodbye, Chairman. The alien stood up, looking at Arthur one last time. You have won your isolation, human. But you have no allies out there. The galaxy is a very dark, very cold place. Arthur turned his back on the most powerful being in the galaxy. We know, Arthur said softly. We'll leave a light on for you. As the heavy blast doors closed behind the alien delegation, Arthur finally let out a long, ragged breath. The rigid posture he had held collapsed. He braced his hands flat on the aluminum table, his head hanging low as a tremor ran through his tired arms. David stepped up beside him. You okay, Arthur? I'm tired, David, Arthur whispered, closing his eyes. God, I'm so damn tired. We did it, David said, a fierce, quiet pride in his voice. We actually made them blink. Arthur slowly walked over to the small viewport, looking down at the red, dusty curve of Mars, and beyond it, the infinite starry black of space. Humanity hadn't begged for a seat at the council's table. We had flipped the table, walked out into the dark, and built our own future. And nobody in the galaxy would ever dare tell humanity to sit down again.